Can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay. All right. Welcome to Marx 313. At our last seminar in Paris, we discussed Marx's series of articles from 1842 on the debates in the Rhine Provincial Assembly over a law enacted to prohibit the gathering of dead wood by the poor in the private and communal forests of the region. In those articles, Marx spotlighted the utter brutality of class warfare, the way that penal servitude was imposed for stealing twigs and dead wood. In conversation with Judith Revel, the philosopher, and in conversation with Michel Foucault's rich work on the political economy of illegalisms, we explored how Marx's critique could nourish our present-day debates over penal abolition and help inspire a societal shift from a punitive society to a cooperative society. Tonight, in our seminar Marx 313, we turn from those debates over abolition to contemporary debates over human rights and their relationship to politics. We don't leave the terrain of law. In fact, we're going to be deeply immersed in questions of civil and human rights. But we do transition, importantly, from a time in 1842 when Marx was arguing for a legal settlement based on customary rights of the poor, you'll recall, right? To a set of articles 2 years later in 1844, in which Marx calls instead for a revolution in Germany and for human as opposed to political or legal or rights-based emancipation. So we transition from a narrowly juridical debate over customary rights to a much broader debate about the relation between legal rights and politics in a liberal democratic state, and the relationship between civil, supposedly non-political society and the realm of state politics. In this session of Marx 313, we'll be reading Marx's published articles from 1844 that appeared in the German-French Annals, publication that he founded and edited with Arnold Ruge, and that actually they only published one volume, one issue. We'll be focusing mostly on the article on the Jewish question, but also his introduction to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. The article on the Jewish question famously argued for a thoroughgoing social upheaval that would transform self-interested individuals into members of a shared community, called for human as opposed to political emancipation. The article on Hegel's philosophy called for outright radical revolution in Germany by force to overthrow social conditions that, in Marx's words, debase and enslave ordinary people. It was, in Jean Hyppolite's words, a first communist manifesto 4 years before the real communist manifesto. Now, to read these texts, and especially on the Jewish question, we have the great privilege of having with us Professor Jean-Louise Cohen of Columbia University, who will be presenting these materials and actualizing them for our current moment. Now, Professor Cohen suggested that we read Marx's article on the Jewish question in conversation with the French political theorist Claude Lefort's return to Marx, and specifically to Marx's essay on the Jewish question, in his article in 1980, Human Rights and Politics, Droit humain et politique, which he wrote in connection with the rise of human rights discourse among dissidents in the Soviet bloc during the 1970s. That pairing of Marx and Lefort, 1980, and the triangulation with Jean Cohen's own writings on Lefort and Marx is particularly relevant today at this moment because of the way in which Lefort placed the debates over human rights within the context of the struggle between democratic forces and totalitarian forces. This resonates so poignantly right now that this is really an ideal time to return to these debates and push them forward. Actually, in preparation for tonight, I was reading another essay on human rights and that Claude Lefort wrote, and he delivered it in Brussels, and it was published in 1984. And it was an article on human rights and the welfare state. It's collected in a later essay, collection of his called Essai sur le politique. And I came across this stunning passage on page 43, where he writes, we often hear people say these days that democracy and totalitarianism differ only in their degree of oppression. Better still, some people like to talk about totalitarian democracy, quote unquote, those terms, totalitarian democracy. But just be honest about that term, he says. It's a palpable absurdity. So Lefort then kind of goes into, critiques the possibility of the idea of conjoining totalitarianism and democracy, or this idea of totalitarian democracy. I fear that we're going to really need to re-examine these matters more and more in light of the large popular majority for President-elect Donald Trump in the last elections and his announcements this week of his cabinet, including Matt Gaetz for Attorney General, Pete Hegseth for Secretary of Defense, Tulsi Gabbard for Director of National Intelligence, and I just hear John F. Kennedy Jr. for Secretary of Health. Yes, sorry, Robert RFK Jr. Yes. So I'm hoping that once we have set the stage for our seminar by returning to Marx's 1984 articles and explaining them, by reading them through Claude Lefort's re-examination critique from 1980, by discussing the place of human rights discourse in democracy and politics, and considering Lefort's work on democracy and totalitarianism, we'll also be in a good position today in this seminar to address the current conjunction of the relation between democracy in this country and the threat of authoritarian government. So two quick things before I turn it over to Jean Cohen first, although Professor Cohen needs no introduction here, just a few words of introduction. And then a quick word about the other essay, which we won't be talking about that much. So I can't think of a better guide for us for this seminar on these materials than Jean Louise Cohen, the Nell and Herbert Singer Professor of Political Theory and Contemporary Civilization in the Department of Political Science at Columbia University. She's written numerous books on the topic and articles, especially relevant to tonight's seminar, including Class and Civil Society, The Limits of Marxian Critical Theory, Civil Society and Political Theory, and most recently, Populism and Civil Society. Professor Cohen's been working on questions of hybrid regimes, particularly in the US, just published in Constellations, and is working on another piece on cycles of oligarchy, democracy, and authoritarianism as part of a larger project. So this is just perfect to have you with us tonight. Thank you. And so in conversation with the Lefort essay, Professor Cohen will actualize the import of the 1844 article for our current political situation. I recommend, if you haven't, the brilliant essay that she's written and will be drawing from today, that's on the website, on the 1313 journal, as well as another background introduction and a short article by a master's student at the École des Hautes Études, Anissa Braham, on Claude Lefort, which is really good. Then the only other thing I'll say then is just a quick word about the other article that we're going to touch on less, but I think that in a way, it kind of is the segue to on the Jewish question. And that is the introduction to the very dense work that Marx had done on Hegel's philosophy of right, his critique. As you know, that the work itself, which was never published, was a dense, annotated critique going to passages, reading through the passages and the paragraphs from the philosophy of right and critiquing them, but the introduction ended up being really a call for revolution more than anything. And it was a somewhat remarkable piece of political praxis, but in a way, it's set up on the Jewish question. So that's what I just wanted to say quickly, since we're not going to, since Professor Cohen's going to go right into on the Jewish question. So as you know, in the piece, there are really three steps. The first one is Marx kind of affirming the Feuerbachian critique of religion, but then saying that what that means is that we need to critique civil society. We need to critique the human sphere. That was the whole point of that. And then the second point he makes is that instead of critiquing the German human sphere of politics, we need to critique, which is anachronistic in his word, we need to critique the political philosophy, the Hegel's political philosophy, particularly of the German state. And it's in that third step, that he really sets up the conflict that's at the heart of On the Jewish Question. He resolves the criticism of Hegelian philosophy by turning to practical action, here radical, revolutionary practical action. And he's explicit about this, that the one means to resolve the contradictions in Hegel's theory of state and law is the practical activity here, the practical activity of the working class, of the proletariat, who kind of appears on the scene in this piece. Marx calls for revolution, quote, a revolution that will raise it not only to the official, it being Germany, not only to the official level of modern nations, but to the human level, which will be the immediate future of these nations. And of course, what he's indexing right there is the theory of human emancipation that he develops On the Jewish Question. And of course, prefiguring the idea of communism that he'll expand on in the next sessions of Marx 1313 and the Paris manuscripts of 1844, and of course in the German ideology, and of course in the Communist Manifesto in 1848. So in a way, it's the philosophical critique that leads to the practical action, that leads to the need for human emancipation, which takes us right then to On the Jewish Question and Professor Cohen.
You can hear me?
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you for the introduction. And I can't resist saying this. In many ways, going back to this, which happens to be the first, Marx, the first book I wrote and the first stuff I really worked on, and having Trump in power gives me this horrible sense of deja vu all over again. I'll explain that maybe later, but I'm going to rise above my depression and do Marx. That always cheers people up. So I'm actually just going to read through my post. I don't know if you read it, but it says what I want to say, and it says it better than I could ad-lib now, so I might as well read it. All right, so the critique of rights, of formal, or in today's parlance, liberal democracy and of civil society has reemerged today. Once again, the rights of man or human rights are seen as unpolitical or a distraction, while constitutional democracy and the state are under attack from the right and the left as tools of the establishment, a cover for oligarchy, or structures that serve particularistic interests, rather than the public purposes for the public good. In response, populist strongmen on the right and on the left purport to restore the popular sovereignty to the true people that has been usurped by political elites, the establishment. Insofar as the state, equated with the deep state, and formal procedural democracy, deemed a sham, has been severed from any real connection to or control by the people, the call is for a more immediate or radical form of democracy that reunites state and civil society, social and political life, and leaders who embody the people with the people themselves. While much of the critique has real purchase, I argue that the solution that Marx offered, and whatever these guys offered, is a chimera that would only lead to authoritarianism and even more injustice instead of democratization and real solidarity. So it's instructive to go back to Marx and his critique of formal democracy, of rights, and the separation of state and civil society, which he really develops On the Jewish Question. But it's also worth looking at the brilliant appropriation of Marx by Claude Lefort, written over 100 years after, actually 140 years after, yes, 1980. And we can discuss what in our own historical movement, which I'll get into a little bit at the end, 40 years after Lefort's critique, actually more than 40 years. I'm not great with numbers. No, in 1980, what years is all right. Yeah, we'll get into it. Anyway, so first of all, Marx. So we need to reassess Marx's on the Jewish question. As we know, and as I think was just said, by 1843, Marx had moved beyond the Feuerbachian critique of religion, man makes God, God doesn't make man, to the critique of civil society and politics, from invertive to immanent critique, contrasting norm and reality. But as Lefort argues, Marx's concern is not simply to show that the universalistic principles involved in formal democracy and declarations of rights, freedom, equality, justice, are transgressed in practice, or even that their expression permits their transgression. Instead, Marx tries to conceive of a society in which power, oppression, domination, and injustice no longer exist, obviating the need to reflect on institutions that can constrain power, moderate injustice, or enable actors to contest it. Marx's analysis leads him to reject the differentiation of civil society and the state, of law, power, and right, as tantamount to political alienation. There lies the force of the essay, the focus of the essay, despite its title. According to Marx, Bauer and the other left Hegelians remained caught within the critique of religion and misunderstood the key developments and tasks of their own time, namely the meaning and limits of political emancipation ushered in by the French and the American revolutions, and the need, as we just heard, for a second revolution that will accomplish true human emancipation. He does note that political emancipation is real, practical, and entails great progress. He deduces the logic of political emancipation from its most advanced forms then, namely in the United States and the American states. The creation of a formally democratic state, replete, we're talking about the logic of it, replete with a full panoply of civil and political rights, not that these were achieved there, but rights of man in the French declarations for all citizens and individual members of civil society. Political emancipation involves the democratization of the state, giving all citizens in principle equal access to participate in popular sovereignty through standing for and voting in elections, and its differentiation from civil society, itself constituted by sets of rights, and the principle of equality before the law, in which the rights of man protect the individual's everyday material, spiritual, and intimate and other freedoms deemed private. As indicated, through immanent critique, Marx articulates the universalistic principles of the free, self-determining political communities of citizens and of autonomous, self-determining individuals interacting with each other in civil society with equal right to social justice, satisfaction, and solidarity. But his argument is that these principles cannot be realized in the institutions and dynamics of modern bourgeois civil society, which he inflates, or through political emancipation. Political emancipation entails the emergence of the state as a formally democratic domain, freed from extrinsic particularistic limits and qualifications, and civil society as a private sphere, freed from politically imposed and legalized social and status hierarchies. This is the logic. Political emancipation creates equal political rights of the citizen, the universalistic norms of citizenship, sovereignty of the people, autonomy, equality, democracy, etc., and assures at least the formal legal recognition of the individual as a citizen and as a rights-bearing person, enjoying equal protection of the law, disassociating status and right. Again, in principle. So political emancipation means, for example, there can be no religious tests, no religious qualifications for citizenship or rights to vote and participation in popular sovereignty. Bauer's mistake, he was still in the thrall of the critique of religion as on freedom, was to assume that political emancipation, most students get this wrong, but it was to assume that political emancipation or equal political rights for all citizens requires that they surrender religious identity. He doesn't see that political emancipation or formal democracy requires only that the state abolish religion in the form of freeing itself from any tie to religion, either as a state religion and abandoning religious qualifications for citizenship. Bauer, in short, confuses political with what Marx calls full human emancipation. It's only that next step that would entail the abolition of religion and the renunciation of religious identity, which they all thought was a form of unfreedom. The same holds true for property qualifications for the vote. Formal democracy renders property irrelevant to political rights of the citizen when it abolishes property qualifications for the vote. It's the same thing with education, rank, occupational, and other distinctions. But, and this is Marx's most famous and most seductive move, was seduced me way back, by declaring these distinctions to be non-political, i.e. irrelevant to citizenship rights, the political emancipation of the formerly democratic state doesn't abolish these distinctions. It relegates them to the private sphere of civil society, where they retain all their force, and indeed dynamics are located there in civil society along with oppression, hierarchy, and injustice. So, political emancipation doesn't emancipate the individual from the power of these forces in civil society. On the contrary, religion and property, his real concern, is constructed as private and holds full sway in civil society. The product of the differentiation of state and civil society and political emancipation is thus, on the one hand, the abstract citizen who participates in an imaginary, illusory, abstractly solidary, free and equal community in the state, but he exercises no real direct sovereignty. Political emancipation is tantamount to political alienation. What about the individual member of civil society? Marx plays on the ambiguity of the German term bürgerliche Gesellschaft, Bürger as city versus citizen, versus bourgeois. He construes it as bourgeois society where property exercises, later, of course, it's capital. Property exercises fully its power to exploit and dominate. This becomes clear in his gloss on the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, in asking, who is this man of the rights of man as distinct from the citizen? He says it's the individual in civil society. The man of civil society, counterposed to the citizen, is the material man, who goes about in his everyday workaday life, pursuing his private interests in competition with others, free competition. But this human of human rights is constituted by rights. It's the move that seduces everyone. This is the atomistic, isolated, egoistic, privatized individual whose liberty is based on the separation of man from man, whose security for the law is ultimately and primarily the security of property, and who is constructed as a self-sufficient moment. Despite the law being formally the same for all, it is property that is placed at the core of all of these rights, according to Marx, and reigns supreme under private law. So the citizen of political society and the man of civil society are a double abstraction. The citizen participates in an imaginary solidarity and community in a formally democratic state that is differentiated from and rules over him. The individual is reduced to profane, private, materialistic being shorn of social solidarity and community in his everyday life, pursuing his egoistic interests in a bourgeois economic civil society, a struggle which is this double abstraction obscures domination which is here. Marx concludes that the principles enunciated with political emancipation, as I said before, can't be realized on the terrain of the differentiation of state and civil society. And so what he argues for is a second revolution that will transform the core of civil society, realize full human emancipation by differentiating state and civil society. And he ends the essay, well, part of this is, so that the individual absorbs the abstract citizen into himself, no longer separating social power from himself as political power. So despite noting the progress in emancipation accomplished in the democratic revolutions of the 18th century, Marx deems the civil and political freedoms to be ultimately ideological and elusive, obviated by and concealing structures of domination and power in civil society. And the state. The alternative he proposes gestures towards some sort of immediate radical democracy, though it's always been unclear what that's supposed to be. Now, this is a powerful critique, and it has influenced many generations of thinkers critical both of the merely formal character of what is today called liberal democracy and of declarations of rights embedded in constitutions or in international human rights documents, accused of reducing politics to a moralistic humanism that serves to justify and enable instead of limiting power and protecting individuals with a legal persona. There have been different answers to just who the human, the man, the subject of the rights discourse is. And depending on whether it comes from Marxists, it's the bourgeois, communitarians, it's the atomistic individual, feminists, it's the male, critical race theory, it's the white man, post-colonial theorists, it's the white, Western white bourgeois male, or queer theory, the heterosexual, heteronormative as a subject of rights. All of these answers follow the original Marxian movement, often with less talent, as Lefort noted, insofar as they reduce right and law to power and to quote before, as Bernard said, lose the ability to differentiate democracy from autocratic or totalitarian regimes before its key concern. So the question is, was Marx right? Did he get it right? Is his analysis of civil society, formal democracy, and human rights correct, or is it one-sided in a somewhat counterproductive way? According to Lefort, the answer is yes and no. So we move to Lefort. Coming from within the Marxist tradition, Lefort's post, not anti, but post-Marxist engagement with Marxist critiques of rights, law, civil society, democracy was, as we've heard, triggered by the emergence of struggles for emancipation in totalitarian regimes, the USSR, East Europe, China, i.e. against a form of near total domination. The dissidents framed their struggles in terms of human rights, claiming that their struggles were moral and not political. But of course, that was for strategic reasons, fear of brutal suppression. Lefort sets out to demonstrate that the struggle for rights is indeed political and theorizes such struggles as part and parcel of the struggle for democracy. So he situates his own return to Marxism on the Jewish question in the context of the discovery of the Gulag and the blindness of the French left in those days to the significance of the dissident struggle due to their devaluation of rights along the along the lines of Marxist. If we don't rethink the Marxian critique, we won't be able to see what's innovative and political about a politics of human rights that declared itself to be unpolitical, assuredly in a context when engaging in overt political struggle risks being sent to the camps. But in theorizing the struggle for rights as a mode of democratic politics, Lefort does not embrace the liberal, humanistic, or anarchistic interpretation that lodges human rights in the individual subject as a set of moral principles, elaborating a religion of resistance to all power. This, he notes, turns the difference between democracy and totalitarianism, you read that phrase, into a mere difference of degree of oppression. I call his analysis post-Marxist because it's meant to extricate ourselves from Marxist framework without falling behind his thought. His critiques of rights was not at all pointless, but it is in key respects mistaken and ideological. Indeed, Lefort refused both the Marxist and ultra-leftist reductionist critiques of human rights and formal democracy as mere liberal and bourgeois ideology, while rejecting the ideological Cold War liberal and neo-conservative position that appropriated the concept of totalitarianism. That framed the new human rights discourses and movements in Soviet-type societies as efforts to catch up with the achievements of the West, while supporting, at the same time, Latin American dictatorships in their own backyard. Both fall for the ideology of rights that reduce individuals in civil society to egoistic, disassociated monads based on an atomistic bourgeois society differentiated from the state. Lefort's brilliant analysis, a brilliant argument, is that Marx was not wrong in what he saw in the rights of men. The problem is what he was unable to find in it. Really nice. Lefort notes that the ambiguities of human rights, as many formulations do give substance to the image of a sovereign individual whose power to act or possess or speak a right is limited only by the power of other individuals to do likewise. He notes that it isn't arbitrary to regard the right of property in the French declarations as the only right deemed sacred, and as the one which many others seem to be based on, especially the rights of security, police. Indeed, Lefort thought Marx was right to denounce relations of domination and exploitation concealed behind the bourgeois conception of human rights, of freedom, equality, justice, etc., as are the feminist, anti-racist, post-colonialists today. I mean, I'm adding that. They also are not wrong about what they criticize. But Lefort's point in getting at the underside of the underside is to show that the concept of human rights operates on a different register than that of power and can't be reduced to this ideological role or conception. Instead of focusing on legalistic or ideological interpretations, functions, and the form of domination that conceal, Lefort reasons from the perspectives of the movements and dynamics involved in asserting, claiming, and inventing rights, and on the symbolic meaning of the very idea of the right to have rights, of man and citizen, gesturing towards Anna Arendt, who is very important. This involves a new relationship to the political and a new symbolic order with respect to the legitimating principle of society, helping to inaugurate democracy. And as I've argued elsewhere, there are three aspects of this analysis: human rights in public space. Lefort focuses on what the atomism critique leaves out. Marx does not discuss rights to freedom of speech, communication, to publish, associate, assemble, petition government, opinion, all of this. These can hardly be construed as constructing the isolated individual. Certain. Instead, what they create is a new mode of access to and a new conceptualization of public space, the freeing of communication and public interaction of persons and citizens from the bounded spaces regulated by power. Such rights enable a new mode of sociality, free association, making possible networks of social relationships and horizontal ties in civil society that can target injustice, oppression, and arbitrariness. But the rights to communicate in public space also opens access to participation in and responsibilities for civil public life. The rights to freedom of speech, movement, association, assembly are intimately connected to the conquest of democracy, which also involves invents a new mode of relation to the public space. This dimension is not graspable under the sign of deism, moralism, bourgeois ideology. Instead, it is the creation of the space in which mobilization for more rights, more democracy, more justice can occur. Okay, 2, the politics of asserting and claiming rights. The social practice of declaring and mobilizing around rights is also political. Whether the demand is for legal protection of each individual against the arbitrary exercise of governmental power, or for workers' rights, voice, racial or gender justice, the practice of mobilizing for new rights and new interpretations of old ones rests the power to participate in the politically relevant activity of claim making about the way power is or should be exercised from those in power. So the pragmatic and symbolic meaning of the practice of mobilizing for and asserting and demanding rights has an elective lead to democracy. Both involve inventions and practices outside what is legally institutionalized, outside and beyond the control of power. In this sense, rights assertions are the innovative practice of social movements alongside other modes of democratic contestation and mobilization, insofar as it involves demands for new freedoms, more justice, better practices, laws, etc. Like democratic politics, this opens a theater of contestation outside the control of power. Indeed, since democracies can always become more democratic, since democracy is always an unfinished project, the struggles for further democratization by movement actors, sometimes taken up by political parties, like the struggles for rights, is where innovation outside any formal documents occur, and they cannot be contained by the third and last, the symbolic meaning of rights and democracy. At the deepest level, the symbolic meaning of rights struggles and the practice of democracy, democratic struggles, are connected and both are political. Both are predicated on and help foster the disentanglement of law, right, power, and knowledge. Thinking of the French Revolution and its break with the ancien regime, Lefort notes 3 disincorporations: the disincorporation of rights from power, initially from the king's dual body, the disincorporation of society no longer representable as a body. Civil society is not a body. Forget the frontispiece on Hobbes is the body. It's not a code. It's not a substantial unity. It is now civil society, unbounded, a new mode of association. The disincorporation of power such that we can no longer ascribe to an external being or ruler the agency whereby society forms and apprehends itself in its unity and divisions and relates to itself in time and space. This is the end of monarchical legitimacy, replaced by democratic legitimacy and uncertainty. Power, law, and knowledge are differentiated. The locus of power is the formula of Lefort. It becomes an empty place since no one, no apparatus, no agent can purport to institute and embody society as a political. This means not only that the institutional apparatus of democracy ensures competition, elections, alternation, uncertainty, and prevents, in principle, of course, any branch of government from appropriating the political, it means democracy is an evolved form of society which welcomes indeterminacy, and that no individual group or governmental instance has the inherent right to embody the political order rule, which doesn't mean that upstarts out there are not going to claim this right. This is rather often. In democracies, we also experience a fundamental indeterminacy as to the basis of law, power, knowledge. We don't know. And so there's an unending practice of questioning, contestation, and open-ended politics. This indeterminacy is the epistemology shared by human rights and democracy. Thus, regarding rights, there's no way to anchor the supposedly correct set of rights required by liberalism or democracy or social justice or socialism in the nature of man in a substantive sense. As modes of activity, communication, asserting and claiming rights moves out of the orbit of power, new rights that are not on the books get asserted through innovative practices unknowable in advance. Here too, no one can occupy the place from which they have the authority to grant or derive rights. That place too is empty. Again, not that they don't try. So in response to Marx's question, who is this man of civil society? Lefort's answer is not the bourgeois. It is no one and everyone. No specific characteristic, quality, identity, and feature determines who gets to have rights or what rights they get. Instead, I quote Lefort, man appears as the being whose essence it is to declare his rights. This means that rights are not simply the object of a declaration. It is their essence to be declared in a never-ending practice of rights assertions. Actors create their freedom by declaring their rights, whether or not some document has already acknowledged them. This initiates an open-ended discursive contestatory process of claims and counterclaims, movements and counter-movements, so that rights are one of the generative principles of democracy. The same holds true for projects of the further democratization of democracy. So for Lefort, the differentiation of state and society, civil society, new modes of sociality and participation in politics, the politics these enable are achievements that should be built on, not effaced, through some dream of direct immersion of individuals in communal life, or of democracy, direct democracy that can do without formal democratic rights and rights from institutions. I close with contemporary problems, of which there are. Many years ago, I wrote a book on Marx and endorsed the Lefortian analysis that rejected the reduction of civil to bourgeois society, embraced emancipatory potentials unleashed in both civil society and the formally, if insufficiently, democratic state. Two developments since then call for more thinking on these topics. The first regards the distortions that occur when discourses of human rights no longer feed into democratic politics or democratization, but displace them. I'm thinking of the problems that occur when it is not the residents of a polity, but outsiders who assert the rights of others, invoking international human rights documents, and impose a standard of legitimacy for someone else's polity, short-circuiting domestic struggles for and over democracy, social justice, and rights interpretations. The critique of international human rights discourses stems from this problematic and from the tendency to displace political struggles for social justice and democracy by the moralistic discourses of outsiders. I'm thinking of Sam Moyne's critique. The second pertains to an older problem, namely the capacity of capitalism to subvert appeals to public power for rights, justice, and more democracy by, now getting real and contemporary, by undermining the efficacy public power has to serve public purposes. In short, what happens when private power becomes so enormous and so overwhelming, oligarchic, and so global that public power is so corrupted or eroded that it no longer functions to curb the predations of private capital? In the past, the power of the corporate rich, of the monopolists, the financier, the oligarch, often perverted public power, this is not new, by wielding it directly or inordinately influencing it. I'm thinking of the Gilded Age of the US, there are lots of examples. But this triggered counter movements that have been relatively successful. The New Deal, social democracy, the labor movement, however flawed they were. But today, gigantic transnational private quote, in quotes, I'm being sarcastic, civil society actors, i.e. the global corporate rich, monopolists, new forms of finance capitalists, incapable not only of doing an end run around the state attempts at regulation, but also eviscerating public power altogether. Watch the show with our new president. Be it through privatization or projects of reduction of the state to a mere minimum. Think of Project 2025. The overwhelming power of the corporation making use of private law, private rights, seems poised to destroy the very notion of public power exercised for public purposes. Are we now finally in a situation where this kind of private power in civil society does indeed render formal democracy and basic rights of state and public power really facades for transnational oligarchy? Can we still invoke democracy and rights in our struggle in civil and political society on the national and global level? Or do we need additional language and tools to effectuate a reversal of the power of private capital, of its power to eviscerate public life, democracy, rights, and justice? Is this just another phase of the cycle that, regarding the United States, that the Schlesingers and others, think of Fishkin, talk about regarding oscillations between the predominance of public and private power? Or are we at a kind of irreversible tipping point? I'm not ready to deliver civil society rights and democracy to the power of capital, but I leave the question to you.
Thank you, Jean. So you yourself have posed questions for us all for this seminar, which I hope we're going to address, particularly in your conclusion, when you're asking essentially whether or not we've reached a different point, whether we've reached a tipping point. And so I hope that we're going to address that. I'd like to maybe raise 3 questions and also then maybe give you an opportunity, but I know there's a lot of people who want to also jump in. So I'll be succinct and I'll go straight to the point, I think. So the first has to do with turning human rights and turning the question of human rights into a question of human rights discourse, which I think is what Lefort was doing, and I think that is the move that we make in modern times or in contemporary times. And we make that move in part because we think of most things now through the lens of discourse. In part, I think that was the influence of Foucault on our contemporary ways of thinking the world. And there's one way in which I read Lefort as doing that move. And it's the discourse of human rights becomes an important political force. And that's my interpretation of Lefort. It becomes an important political force that contributes to a particular political vision that opens things up to different ways of thinking politically, right? And that was particularly true at the time with this behind the Iron Curtain, right? And in a way, for Lefort, human rights discourse is what allows him to try to suggest other visions of politics. Now, the problem is this, I think. Once you've reduced human rights or the right to have rights, say, to discourses about human rights, then I feel that there's very little left to argue about. In a way, it's a neutralizing move. That means that we've really given up on the idea of human rights or the strength, the foundation, something, the kind of the essentiality of human rights. And now we're just talking as it's one discourse among others, right? I mean, it's a good way of arguing in the political sphere. It becomes rhetorical. It becomes a question of persuasion. I think once we've reduced the idea of human rights to human rights discourse, then the questions become empirical. Is it a persuasive form of argument right now? Will it convince people? Is it more persuasive than other forms of political argumentation? And to a certain extent, it becomes a question of strategy. Now, in the human rights context, I'm comfortable with that, particularly because as a lawyer, there are many contexts in which I have no alternative but to be engaged in human rights discourse. Literally, I've just been spending all my time amending a habeas corpus petition. I just filed it on Tuesday. It's 484 pages long, and it is nothing but human rights discourse. I mean, it's nothing but civil rights discourse. It's nothing but discourse about due process, about ineffective assistance of counsel, about Brady obligations, constitutional obligations to turn over exculpatory evidence that was not turned over for 19 years, et cetera. It's nothing but that language, that discourse. Now, and I'm comfortable being strategic about that. But I think that I don't think that someone who is wedded to human rights in a more fundamental way should be comfortable with that. And the reason I say that is that I'm comfortable with that in the human rights context. I'm not comfortable with that, say, with arguments about cooperation, right? I don't think that, I mean, I believe that cooperation is the future and is the way we should be thinking about political economy. Now, and I'm not prepared to say that's just a discourse of cooperation and I'm just being strategic. I'm not just being strategic. I actually think that's right. Okay. Now, if I were, and now I am a human rights lawyer, but if I felt that way about human rights, I wouldn't be satisfied saying, well, it's just a discourse. It's convenient. It can open up some politics. It can change it. You know what I mean? It's just like, that wouldn't satisfy me. So I'm personally fine with thinking about a discourse, but then it's odd to me that there are these other contexts in which I'm not prepared to simply make it's just discourse. Okay, so that's the first thing. Okay, you want, go ahead. Am
I on? This is on.
Yes. Yes, you're up. Go ahead. And then I can,
That
we
was
can,
the,
you go ahead. Yeah. Go.
that was the most compromising and least quoting thing I have ever heard.
Well, partly. Yes, partly.
What you are saying.
Partly.
And two things. One is what you are saying that it's truthful. This is correct. We have human rights, or we should have human rights in the truth. That's a compromising kind of idea. The strategic use of discourse, that's okay. Now, I don't know why you can't have both. What Lefort said, although Lefort was not partial, and he was very opposed to reducing all the forms of punitive action to strategic, but he said that the dissidents were making a strategic claim insofar as they denied that their assertion of human rights was political. He didn't say that I don't think he meant to present the discourse of human rights itself as merely strategic. So I'm not sure if I agree with your interpretation of it. But I think that, you know, in the practice of asserting rights, you have to say, I think you have to. And what over it. And this is the truth. I have the right to be treated. Give me some reasons why I'm not, and you're never going to do this. Okay, so these are truth. But and yes, I think performatively one has to, just like you believe in cooperation. And I don't know if it's just belief. I mean, give me arguments, but you can't just say, well, that's how I feel. That explanation. How you feel? I want to know what you think, and give me some arguments. Okay, so okay, I just had.
No, that's really helpful. That's really helpful. That's a really helpful clarification or intervention. Because when you read Lefort's text, you also have other arguments. Let's call them arguments right now. Could call them discourses. Other arguments that appear, right? So, for instance, he talks a lot about autogestion in this piece, right? So self-management, which I relate to cooperation. I mean, he actually mentioned, as I mentioned, he actually speaks about the lip factory occupation, which we spent a lot of time last year studying, watching the documentary with Etienne Balibar and whatnot. But autogestion, for instance, I don't think wouldn't need human rights framework for autogestion, right? So you can get to the same place that he seems to be going, which are novel, new, left, you know, friendly to Marx visions, with or without human rights discourse, right?
Well, you know, this is I find it interesting because first of all, before the theories of democracy,
right?
And he said that the flip side, I never understood. I never knew who they were referring to. The critics of human rights said that, you know, not everything is human rights. What is something else? So no, what you just Jones about something else. It's about the claim that we workers, should be able to have a say, run, depending on how far you go, run, own, whatever our factory work does. You know, human rights framing pertains to certain struggles. Other framing pertains to other struggles. I don't know why these have to be, why there only has to be one or whether these. So I don't see a problem with that. Again, I'm not, for me, the issue is really, Marx does a double move. One is he, in the name of some kind of very vague, immediate democracy, he conceives of formal democracy as merely formal. You have the right to seek individual democracy. But the point is not that my point is not that that's formal democracy. It must be supplemented with many other modes, etc. And this is not a human rights system, this is something else. And you know, I think we should open it up, but you know, the issue of autogestion is about economic participation, justice, however, depending on who's formulating for what, whether it's workers' councils or whatever it was. I can't forget the name of the Yugoslavia, but in any case, so it's about a mode of cooperation that would entail something other and better than this structure.
Right. Yeah. I mean, let's open it up because I think we've got enough here and possibly enough sources of kind of tension to try and figure out. Does anybody want to start us off with a question or a comment or an intervention? Yes. Okay. Here. Why don't you take that mic there? Pass that mic down. And push the thing towards you so that it's on. Yeah.
for a wonderful talk and also a great conversation. I want to kind of follow up on this and on what you just said about the sort of alternate discourses. So you sort of talked about the capture of the private sphere by, the rich, monopolistic, but in my understanding of the critique of capital, the problem is not the person, right? Capital is a social relation, it's an impersonal form of domination. And so the challenge to confronting the way that private power can undermine public power, undermine the public power serving the interests of the public, as you said, is not like about how do we get the rich regulated, right? It's about coming up with a different form of, shall we say, economic, private coordination of production and consumption. And so what I want to ask you is how that project of cooperatives that takes coordination of production and consumption out of an impersonal system, socially necessary labor time, which is, shall we say, it's impersonal. It is abstracted from the particular qualities of the individual, of their upbringing. So it gives you a sort of universality, like you are a worker and not a blacksmith and not a member of the estate, right? Not like one of the sort of like Hegel's philosophy of right, where your personal identity is immediately attached to your form of work. What I worry is that if we move towards something like cooperatives, where the economic decisions become more localized and deliberative, that the distinction between who I am as a producer and who I am as a member of the public might not be able to be retained, or that there's at least a kind of tension or challenge that I would like to hear you speak to. How do we reclaim, not just from the rich, but from socially necessary labor time, the private sphere, while empowering the sort of universality of human individuality that is the basis of human rights discourse?
Yes. Sheila Benabib, do you want to get the mic? We need to speak in the mic, not so much for people in this room, but actually for people on Zoom. That's why. If you can
Okay,
push it down.
well, thanks, Jean, for this wonderfully clarificatory discussion. And I want to say something about what seems to be the disagreement between yourself and Bernard, or rather Bernard's disagreement about your Lefort reading and what may be at stake there. And then I want to say something about an issue concerning international human rights, which may not be at the center of the discussion for a lot of people, but nonetheless, this is something that I'd like to clear up. It seems to me as if when Bernard talks about the discourse of human rights, it's not just whether it's a truth claim. In Habermasian language, it would be a validity claim, not a truth claim, but that's not the issue. The issue is that Bernard seems to assume that the discourse of human rights is a totalizing political philosophy, whereas the argument that you make, and I completely agree with you, is that the project of democracy makes no sense without a robust analysis of human rights, their symbolic function, their political function, etc. So I didn't hear you making the argument that the discourse of human rights equals to an emancipatory political philosophy.
Right.
I heard you making the argument that you have to have a clear view of the value of human rights within any kind of emancipatory discourse. And Bernard, there is in the French context, there is, of course, the use of the discourse of human rights by the new right as well. And so there is an attempt to try to distinguish, the reduction of kind of political philosophy at that time to a kind of human rights discourse and the left appropriation of it, right, which is what Lefort, I think, was trying to do. This is, I think, more pertinent maybe to the discussion between the two of you, but I want to come back to this question of international human rights because Jean knows I've always disagreed with this. Look, I think that since Justice Scalia's influence on the American Supreme Court, the United States has pushed itself away from the international law domain. And there's a lot of rhetoric, both on the right and the left. And I call this sovereigntism. There is a right sovereigntism that began with Scalia, and that's going to end us in Trump, but there is also a left sovereigntism that reduces international human rights discourse to moral do-goodism. I think this is reductionist. And my example here, this is not the content, but my example here is the influence of CEDAW in the global south. There are a lot of critiques of CEDAW, and it does not incorporate enough socioeconomic rights, and it privileges women's civil and political rights. Yes, correct. But it's also the case that a document like CEDAW is used by all sorts of civil society groups in the global south against sexual discrimination, to plead for alimony rights and so on. So international human rights also can have an emancipatory function if they are appropriated by social movements. So in that sense, I'm agreeing with you. I think this discourse of them being brought in by, do-goodism and so on, it's not quite correct. It doesn't quite meet the political facts on the ground in terms of what's happening. So I see international human rights very much in the same way that you see the relationship of human rights and social movements.
Yeah, two questions, otherwise I'm going to forget. So, no, it's not about regulating persons, although some persons I wouldn't mind seeing regulated, especially when we see, we are really now, the question of oligarchy is becoming real. Wait till you see the new cabinet or fake cabinet or whatever it is. But no, of course, it's about a structure of production, etc. But I don't want to say capitalism is a system, because I don't want to. How should I put this? I think the question is mentioned cooperation, different forms of organization of production. The question is what. There's two versions. One is what should be in the market and what should not. It's one version. The other is in terms of the structure of production, depending on what we're talking about, the factor or whatever we're talking about here, are there forms of coordinating workers and labor that would enhance their voice, their ability to cooperate, to be heard and taken seriously, because they know how to do this better than some distant manager, et cetera. And by the way, there are forms in other countries like, I don't know, Germany, Mittelstimmung, or wherever, where, the United States is Neanderthal. But what forms of organization at the point of production would involve more healthier forms of cooperation and interaction and communication than the ones we have now? The point is that, you don't want to become, that can take you all the way up to ownership and control, but you could end up in the situation of becoming your own capitalist. One time. What was it called in Yugoslavia? Not workers' control. It's called, no, not council. I can't remember. You can have councils, but councils in the factory don't necessarily have to run the factory. In other words, organizing, it's a complicated thing. You have to know something about it. So, I'm not into formulaic answers here. And it's also a question, when it already escalates up to capitalism. Now, I agree we're not talking about persons, but capitalism, you always say, as opposed to what? What are we talking about? So that's burdens on me. That burdens on somebody else who thinks the problem is capitalism. I never know what the hell you mean. So I used to know meant communism and so whatever socialism is, but you have to get really to talk about what kind of structures are you talking about. Markets, well, as you said, I don't want to be a butterfly on the pin, this worker with this identity, and that's it. I'm more than that. In some instances, money's fine. I don't have to negotiate everything. So you have to be very careful in articulating what forms of cooperation and what forms of coordination would be emancipatory and productive supplement, replace, and to what degree would be the question of what you've gotten. So I think this is a serious question. I do. Especially now, I think because on the Amazon, what are those places called? Warehouses. It's a nightmare. But yeah, so it's a serious question. But I don't think that markets are from, I mean, I do think markets are from cooperation. It's a real pain in the neck to have to negotiate the use value. Give me 3 horses for 2 tools. I mean, that's a real pain in the neck. Let's do it some money, right? So that's a form of coordination and communication. We have to think this through. Now, as for what Shayla said, I'm not quite sure what Shayla said, but I think that well, no, my point was that with the human rights thing, which I'm not that obsessed about it, I think there could be problems, but of course, if social media actors, if the actors, domestic actors are asserting their rights and calling on with so many human rights documents to be instantiated at home, even calling on outside actors to help, that's fine. Now, the problem that I addressed was when no one's doing that, and then this position, and you know, the whole thing of, for example, saving Muslim women from Muslim men. I mean, this is all, you know, this is all the sort of instrumental domination oriented real force along over the closed rights is problematic. But again, so I don't think there's any disagreement. But I do think that there are many problems that we would have to frame. But you know, that we would have to frame in terms of nuanced analysis of the structure of production, of exchange, of consumption, of publics, of state, of civil society, and et cetera.
Rosalind Morris, why don't you jump in, and then I want to jump back in too, but you're taking my.
Thank you. Nice to be in this room with you all again. And thank you, Jean, for a remarkable, really lucid and demanding paper. I want to hear you talk more about 2 things. I mean, vis-a-vis the temptation and your advocacy of our resistance to the temptation to turn back to the 1840s as the exemplary instance for modeling the contemporary political. I mean, one does need to take some account of the fact that, you know, a good third of the world's population is entirely outside of the wage system at this point. And the paradigmatic understanding of the basis for cooperation, for forming any kinds of solidary alliances are quite different for these masses of people who are outside of the wage system, who are illegalized in migrancy and so forth. But on the other end, because you ended with this, you know, are we at the tipping point question, which is very much on all of our minds. I mean, this new oligarchy is so dependent upon, you know, platform media capitalism, and is so bent on dismantling the regulatory apparatuses and all those dimensions of the state that could have inhibited the distorted exercise of private capital-based power. You know, I want to understand what you think might be the options for that. I mean, you know, the move to Bitcoin and other things which so many of these people are advocates of is another means of not only disabling the state's control of something like a public purse, but they bind us ever more into dependency upon this very economy in which the best people hope for is equal access to inequality, and in which the, you know, everyone is dependent on the increasing differentiation and hierarchization in the economic sphere, because, you know, that's how that finance system, derivatives-based system works. So I want to hear you talk a little bit more about this contemporaneity, the vision of the sphere in which people come together, make their claims, freedom of association, press, and so forth. These were notions that used you know, anti-social media. And both as a form of capital and as a distorting factor in the space of possible social movements. That strikes me as kind of, you know, our big challenge at this moment.
Thank you, Rosie.
Uh, yeah. It's on, right? Okay. Well, that is the big challenge. And I think that we have, well, some people have paid attention to this. Some people even here, Katerina Pistro, for example, has done a lot with this and is doing more. And I'm just getting back into it now. But, you know, we have to reflect on why is this discourse against, not discourse, why is talk against the state? Trump, get the state off our back. The problem is the state. We don't trust the state. The state is a deep state. Well, Sheila's from Turkey. I can assure you, if we had a deep state, first of all, Trump would not be walking around because the CIA or the FBI would have gotten him. So we don't have a deep state. The state is not the deep state, but Americans are utterly baffled and confused about what the state actually does for them and what the source of their problems really are. So, but the oligarchs, again, I don't mean to individualize this. What do you want? Capital, the capitalists, whoever you want, whatever you want to say, finances, they know what they're targeting. And for them, the project is privatization on every single level. So it's the power, not just privatization of armies, of prisons, all those things, but it is the autonomization of the power of private capital, property, oligarchy, finance, whatever you want to call it. The problem now, I mean, there was a kind of, as I said, inadequate answer once. It was welfare state, social democracy. Well, but you know, the capital went national, the state was there. If you managed to pull it off. But the problem, that was in a situation when half the world was not in the global economy. Russia and China were not players. They weren't in it. Now they are. And we're in a very new world, and capital is transnational. It's very hard to think of what global or even regional political forces in power could tame this. I mean, one had once hopes for the EU. They've been somewhat dashed. The United States is still a big boy out there, and it can do a lot. We could do a lot if we had a different government. But we would have to think of some way of, I still think states are key players, and regional organizations accumulating the political will to cooperate and the political power to tame these forces, again, to regulate them, tax them, push them back, internally democratize them to some extent, not fully, etc. Otherwise, we're in deep trouble. And, you know, I'm not an economist, I don't have an answer, but what we're getting is already the privatization of risk. You're on your own. They're going to go after everything. Social security, everything that was produced, and it wasn't enough ever. Healthcare, the New Deal here, social democracy somewhere else. And why are they going after? They know it because they don't want to be regulated. But I think that, again, I don't mean to be an economic, you know, focus so much on the economy. How can we not at this point? So I think the disabling, so it's not just that public power is not being used for public purposes enough. I do feel a little gloomy, but it's rather that public power is being annihilated. And there's a successful ideology that says that's the enemy. That's the real. I don't know so much whether that's the case in Europe. I don't know. I know if that's the case in France. I really like the state, but I don't know. But here it certainly is. And I think it's very alarming that this is happening. It is the autonomization and incredible imbalance of the role of the corporate rich now, or the financial, whatever you want to call them, the oligarchs, the financial rich, the monopolists, whatever you want to call them. They're transnational. They support each other, and they are, again, I mean, I want to say that civil society is reduced to this because I think that the only hope for struggling against this is always going to be in civil society in conjunction with political side we used to have parties for public purposes and, you know, some kinds of regional cooperation, but again, I don't have a formula for it, but I do see the downsides of this. I wasn't sure what you meant about workers out of the wage system. You didn't mean women, you meant what? People who are not, you meant informal labor? You meant informal, you know.
I mean, apropos of the previous model of abstract labor
Oh,
time
right.
and so forth, I mean, you know, most of Africa nations have unemployment rates of 40% plus.
Oh,
And deproletarianization is the story even of the civil services and has been for a long time. And casualization is the story even within our own spaces. So this mushrooming population is, you know, I mean, I would say there's got to be some, you know, what do you want to call it, education / ideological work as that has to be done in other contexts because, you know, the poor is no longer the worker.
Right.
You know, I mean, there's a kind of radical dissymmetry between these terms at this moment. I mean, what is, I mean, the sad thing, either people want equal access to inequality or they desire to be oppressed by capital because it's better than being not oppressed by capital. You know,
Okay, I wanted to circle back to the question of human rights for just a moment and maybe clarify a few points because because what I was trying to suggest because I think that it got somewhat or it fell between the cracks of some conversations here. And I'm not suggesting this as a critique of your position. I think there is a critique of Lefort in here in this argument. So basically, it has to do with the fact of the way in which Lefort kind of associates human rights with democracy. He does that by very radically disassociating totalitarianism with human rights, right? I mean, and he's creating this dichotomy of totalitarianism and democracy. So in creating that dichotomy and that contrast, in a way, he defines totalitarianism as the space where there are no human rights, right? And so he writes, totalitarianism is on page 246 of the translation. Totalitarianism is built on the ruin of the rights of man, he writes, right? So there's really this idea. And then he continues, he elaborates that and of course, this is what he's very much interested in, almost, I mean, right? Because human rights are almost less important to him than this question of democracy and its relationship to totalitarianism. But when he defines totalitarianism, he talks about it as totalitarianism is on page 248 of the essay. Totalitarianism appears as that regime in which the rights of man are destroyed. The relation between politics and the rights of man, which Marx saw as the two poles of the same illusion, disappears. So in this way of thinking about the dichotomy, the human rights, the rights of man, kind of goes onto the side somehow of democracy. I mean, it fits in that space, right? And is radically excluded from the totalitarian space. Now that's where, that's fine I think if it's and at times I read him to suggest, well, that's just one possible way of thinking about new visions of democracy, which is what he's after, new visions, right? I mean, that's what he wants. He wants to search for new modes of thought and action that are not necessarily Marx anymore, but modified in some way. The question then becomes, in those new modes of thinking about democratic life, and obviously democracy is the most important thing for Lefort here. What role for human rights? Is it just that they can open up some helpful arguments, as you were suggesting, Shayla, in a certain political context, in a certain historical juncture? We can claim rights if it's the Convention on the Rights of Women, for instance, that we can use that to then open things up politically and try and change relations of power? Or is it that actually human rights are somehow structurally wedded into a vision of democracy? Right? That's the distinction I'm trying to get my finger on.
For before they're wedded. I mean, there are two sides to it, but they are part and parcel. I mean, okay, let's go back to the structural. State and civil society differentiate, right? There's the underside, capitalism, the capitalist economy gets differentiated from the state. It gets enabled by it. It gets it does its thing of domination, exploitation, all of this. But civil society, but this is constituted through sets of rights. In other words, the rights to associate, the rights to freedom, the freedom to speak, to assemble, to demand. This is to participate in public spheres, civil publics, political publics. This is democracy. This is without which you do not have democracy. And by the way, the authoritarians, I'm not such a fan of the concept of authoritarianism. So we'll put that aside. But the autocrats, they always know what to go after. What do they go after first? They do censorship. They abolish freedom of association. They go after social movements. They go after all the so-called civil rights of the so-called egoistic men that enable people to actually gather and challenge and participate in and do democracy. I'm just not sure what's bothering. I don't think he has a strategic, instrumental relationship with human rights. I don't think that's what's going on. I think what's going on.
Here's what.
I think you're getting distracted by the word discourse. I think what's going on is that his argument is that these are the flip side of it. You can't imagine. Again, I'm not talking about international human rights. Something's coming up, but I cannot imagine. I don't think he could either. If you're afraid that when you communicate with your friends and make this statement about arbitrary tweets of Trump, that you're going to end up in a gulag. Well, I mean, it's not exactly
Right. Right. Okay.
Okay.
But here's the hitch, I think, is that if that's right, I mean, if it is wedded, and if what we're saying is you need those rights to protect yourself in order to be able to express yourself, associate, etc. Yeah. Well, let's say, okay, well, it's right to have
I don't want
them.
to knock on the door because, and I need habeas corpus because habeas corpus, it's the right thing to do.
Okay, but here's where then Marx's critique on the Jewish question remains, I don't know, convincing and robust here, which is that's not enough in a sense. It's just not enough. In the sense that it isn't telling us in any way what we are going to be arguing for in that right to associate or in that speech or with those rights or with those opportunities, right? So then we still need a full kind of on the Jewish question critique to suggest that that's that's not enough then, right? So and I mean, if that's the case, that's fine. But then we've gotten less far, I think, from on the Jewish question than Lefort was suggesting.
Because the analysis on the Jewish question is not that it's not enough. And nobody says it's enough. The analysis is that this different is that is that these are themselves misleading, ideological. The differentiation of state and civil society, rights and formal democracy are part of the problem. It's not that it's not enough. It's that this is a vehicle for what will then become class domination, for covering over what's really going on, etc. I think that that's the where this ends up going, despite his lip service to political emancipation, is an achievement. But I'll leave it at that.
Okay, hold on. So we've got someone on this point, I take it? Yeah, okay. So can we pass the mic back on? Let's try and stay focused on this question for a second.
No?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, maybe to this point, I wanted to maybe offer a different interpretation of Marx on the Jewish question, because I don't think it is actually about if like rights are politically meaningless or not, right? But I mean, I think the argument is that under conditions of capitalism, all rights are subsumed by private property rights, right? That rights, all other rights, all political freedoms become meaningless because private property subsumes them, right? And so the question would be, right, I mean, how do we also think about human rights when like we take that as the argument of Marx, right? How politically meaningful can human rights be under conditions of capitalism? And I wonder if like Lefort was maybe the wrong reading for tonight, and maybe we could have read some Luxemburg, right? And her criticism of Leninism, where she makes exactly the point, right? I mean, that what a socialist republic should not do is to suspend individual rights, political rights, freedom of assembly, press, and so on, right? But that a socialism needs democracy, right? That you need both, right? But so then it's like not the question of like an either or, of like either democracy or rights, right? But you have to ask the question, how do you institute rights in a non-capitalist way? I think that is the question that Luxemburg would offer us.
Did you want to jump into?
And I kind of wanted to ask the exact same question in an ancillary way, returning to Lefort's text. First of all, thank you for the discussion so far. I take it that Lefort's reading of Marx is, in a sense, going to what Jochen just said, he's trying to relativize the right of property along with these other rights. And Marx's whole point is that, in some sense, right of property is primary. That is, the right to speech, expression, etc. If they come into conflict with the right of property prevails. So I don't see sort of an escape in his view from that. There's no possibility of the account of democracy he's giving where private property can ever be abolished or can ever be systematically attacked. So yeah, that was the question.
Well, I'm always happy to read Rosa Luxemburg.
And we will be.
Although I would say that I agree with the second part. In other words, don't give up rights and democracy with socialism. On the other hand, what socialism is a huge question for me. This does not mean I'm defending cowboy capitalism. It's not the point. But that's the question mark, which we don't have an answer to anymore. I'm sorry. So, but that means if she wants, but she's doing, it's still a Lefortian argument, because if you want rights and democracy in socialism, then they are not reducible to capitalism. Okay, and of course the forms and what in a capitalist, especially if you've got depending on what the government is in a capitalist system and who's in power and what's going on, you can have terrible conceptions of these concepts that really do reinforce, private power, capital, all of this. To the second question, what did you say? Say it again. Oh, I mean, are you sure? I mean, that's an empirical question. I'm not sure that every time the right of property conflicted with freedom of speech or freedom of association of property won. We used to have unions that could associate. There was a big battle over that one. Private property, the Pinkertons didn't want unions to associate. But in terms of speech and association, I'm not sure the property always wins. But even if it won a lot of the time, that what conclusion would you draw from that? Again, I don't want to get forced into this whole thing about rights. I don't think that's so much the issue. I think the issue is that don't throw out babies with the bathwater. You want the babies. Believe me, you want them. In other words, no one's challenging so far the idea that we should not differentiate civil society, economy. I could also talk about economic society, the state, etc. That this differentiation, which is not the source of the problem, Marx took it to be the source of the problem. I think that's deeply, deeply wrong. So that's one point. No one's actually even taking this up, but I think that's a big mistake. And then the point about the critiques of rights, they're all correct, as we said, as Lefort said, unless it's not me, as Lefort said, but they're not the whole story. Otherwise, you couldn't have Rosa Luxemburg saying what she's saying. Couldn't have it. Maybe you want to talk conception of rights, the bourgeois conception, etc. But Marx fell for that one, hook, line, and sinker. So did Charles Taylor. Rights of the atomistic man, from a communitarian perspective. So again, I mean, I think the issue right now is, for me here in the United States, is the attack on the state part of the states and society differentiation. That's what's got me really worried at the moment. And it is a kind of de-differentiation from private capital. It's got me really worried. It's going to be ugly. So that's where I would stop.
Let me jump in for a second and then pass to Sheila Benhabib. And first of all, let me just say, so we'll be doing Rosa Luxemburg on April 2nd. Will be our paired text with Amy Allen when we're looking at the contribution to the critique of political economy. So now, but I did want to say one. I did want to just jump in for a second because there's a lot going on in this conversation, and I want to position myself in a particular way, thinking that I agree with the critique of property rights as being foundational here, and not resolved by Lefort's critique, I think. I somewhat agree with Lefort's argument that not all rights discourse necessarily, though, ties into the right to property. I can imagine ways of arguing rights that have a certain form of collective rights to them. I can imagine rights arguments for collective property, for forms of equality that would undermine or abolish private property. So there's and that's that's a piece of the Lefort that is, I mean, that's important to him because it's what he uses to talk about all of those other rights that he talks about. But I'm the way in which I would interpret that and think it's possible is that one could imagine a discourse of rights that is cooperative in its orientation. I don't see why it necessarily has to be the individual, bourgeois. Okay. But I do believe, but I nevertheless do believe that many of those ways in which rights are expressed still today lead to a form of individualism within our society that is problematic. So I'm trying to negotiate a kind of a narrow space that incorporates some of the Lefort, but in the end, and this is where I think it's all a question of layering, it seems to me, of what is in effect the ultimate objective or the ultimate argument or the ultimate political vision. What is the ultimate political vision, and how and whether rights or rights discourse fits in that. And that's where I feel some distance from where Lefort ends up, because the position that I would take with some vision of something that one might call cooperation democracy, say, so having a democratic element, having a cooperative element, would be one in which, well, rights may still exist in that context, but that's not what it's about. I mean, those would be kind of like shields, maybe in the same context in which they were being used by dissidents or something like that. I mean, some kind of like, it's a backstop, maybe. You know, rights become a backstop, possibly, but not the main thing that I want to be talking about. And not just maybe for strategic reasons in part, but for something more than strategic reasons, because those backstops seem to me to be essential, particularly at a moment like now, and particularly in my life as a human rights attorney. Those are the only thing we have. I can't go into court and talk about anything else. And yet, in terms of political vision, that's not really what I want to be talking about, right? Because it's too basic. It's just not enough, right?
I think that's correct, but I don't think that's what Lefort. I don't think that's what Lefort wanted to talk about only either. And they are backstop, but they're backstop in very important ways. You talk about habeas corpus. That's not about cooperation. That's about the individual. You want to be a legal person. You want to have the rights of a legal person. They are, even those individualistic, just me. You can't throw me in jail in this. That's not reducible to truth. And there are critiques of subjective rights of private law that make that reduction. That's a disaster. You want it. On the other hand, I agree with you, there should be a backstop. For example, in the family, there is no defense, but in the family, right? You speak of, oh, well, rights are going to turn and destroy the family of the community. Seriously? I think you need rights because the family is already publicly destroyed as a community, and you want to, what the rights do, they're a backstop. They don't destroy the community, the left community, whatever it is, but they protect you from when it has been destroyed and you think bad of it. So I agree. Don't think.
Okay. Sheila, is the mic on? And bring it closer, please, for people on Zoom.
No, it seems to be to me. I think I'm more on Jean's side than yours on this, Bernard, because
we've had a lot.
It seems to me that you are juxtaposing emancipatory political philosophy, what you are calling pauperism. That's fine. We can debate that on its own terms. So this discourse about rights, thereby sort of giving them the sense that pauperism is a form of de-differentiation. That is to say, reincorporating political life back into social life that is eliminating the kind of distinction between civil society, market, the law, and the state that we live with since Hegel's philosophy, right? So I think that's a little bit the resistance that you are having. And I think that the other side of the argument would be Of course, one can advocate a concept of emancipatory politics, which can go beyond the politics of rights. But I think Jean made a very important point, that is the indeterminacy of rights struggles within democracy. It's not everything, right? But on the other hand, this indeterminacy is part of what, you know, I call jurisgenerativity, following Robert Cover, and, you know, you use that term as well. And as you yourself pointed out, it may be possible to use that jurisgenerative aspect of rights discourse for the kind of collective rights that we're talking about in terms of paupers, right? So I don't quite see the exclusions or the contradictions that much there. I mean, of course, there is a way in which sort of the orthodox liberalism has limited our vision. You know, we're no longer talking about Hobbes and Locke, life, liberty, and property. I mean, I always say, in the UDHR, there are 20 rights. Show me how many the American Constitution incorporates. Do we have a right to a human right to a paid vacation? We don't, right? So this can be part of a democratic struggle, which need not contradict a more copious, a more enlarged emancipatory vision that will also incorporate other qualities.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's so I agree with the idea that, I mean, we're speaking very broadly about rights here and not the specific rights necessarily that Marx was kind of critiquing in on the Jewish question. And we've kind of infused in that notion of rights the possibility of rights that relate to the collectivity as well. And I can see how those could be useful. I was going to say, and the question here is it just strategy or more than strategy? And this is the thing that I'm not sure of, and that kind of like I come back to, is it more than just, I mean, you can make the argument without the word rights, right? Some argument about collective self-governance. There's no doubt that this is a differentiation, because we're talking about, for instance, forms of self-governance in all aspects of our lives, not just work and not just politics, but living, housing, food consumption, etc. So yes, it is deep differentiation. But the question becomes, is the word and is the reference, is the reference to rights, what does that add to the actual argument, for instance, for a fully cooperative? Now, you know, I'm talking about cooperation, but you could talk about communism, which was what Marx would be talking about, right? So I mean, the vision, the ultimate political vision, it's close, maybe it's not different. To what extent do you need to add the word a right in the positive sense, not as a backstop? As a backstop, I fully understand, right? As a backstop, like, right, prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, that seems like we should use that as a backstop. Tragically, it's about to get eviscerated.
I mean, but we're not, it's like, I don't know.
But for the positive argument,
well, I mean,
positive agenda, do you need to add the word rights to the argument that you're making, is my question. And I'm not sure you're arguing you have to.
I am.
You are. Okay,
Yeah.
good. All right.
I
So,
am,
well, then
for the
that-
following
that question.
reason.
Yeah.
I mean, again, it's getting late and I'm beginning to fade out, but for the following reason. I don't know what you mean by cooperation, cooperation in each domain of life. First of all, I'm assuming the domains of life are differentiated. That's one thing. I hope they are. Because I don't want to drown in some community. Oh, no, I'm also a person, an individual, and I want my private space, the whole thing. I'm sorry. But that doesn't mean that I'm in, a competitive, egoistic capitalist, whatever. Well, I might be. But the point is that, cooperation, that's just a word. It just means that, yes, we need more direct cooperative, maybe you could add democratic structures in various domains of life. Sure. But I think that differentiating these domains and allowing me to float between them, to move back and forth, to get out of the clutches of one, to get to the other, etc. And I know you do too. Because the minute you denied that, believe me, you'd be pulling those backstops real fast. So it does sound like a kind of communitarian thing. I don't want to get into this too much, but I think as long as we're doing cooperative, we want rights, individual rights. Yeah. Exactly. Let me go home. No, I mean, in the sense of being my private sphere, you want a private sphere. You all want a private sphere. Trust me, you really do.
All right, so
Okay.
we have we have some, okay, we should give them, pass the mic around because there's too many people who just want to have just intervene. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for a really interesting piece on Marx and Lefort. This isn't really an objection to Lefort, but perhaps a defense of Marx. So you say that for Lefort, Marx does not discuss rights to, freedom of speech, communication, to publish, etc. These cannot be construed as constructing the isolated individual, and that this dimension is not graspable under the sign of egoism and bourgeois ideology. I couldn't help but perhaps think of the work of, Evgeny Pashukanis in his book, like General Theory of Law and Marxism. Pashukanis seems to think that what we can take from Marx is that there is a homology between the exchange relation or, the value form and the core of law or the so-called legal form. Surely we might say that there are like innumerable legal rights which Marx may not have anticipated. But we might instead think that for Marx, generalized commodity production presupposes a so-called juridic subject who is the bearer of rights in the abstract, whatever rights we take those to be. This is because in the very moment of exchange, subjects have to confront each other as equals simply because exchange is a relation of equivalence. There's also perhaps some sort of recognition of free will because they're presumably freely exchanging the commodity, and they probably also recognize each other as rightful owners of the commodities being exchanged, as proprietors. We might say that in other modes of production where the products of labor, don't take the form of the commodity, the abstract juridic subject does not emerge because the relations of production are relations of, interpersonal social domination. So these, three facets aren't really recognized. So in other words, what I'm trying to say, I suppose, is that, insofar as Marx can make sense of the emergence of an abstract juridic egoistic subject, which unlike other modes of production is a necessary requisite of capitalist society, he also perhaps can make sense of particular rights and their concrete determinations as a result of capitalist society as well.
Thanks. I saw two other hands, I think, and then we're going to wrap it up. Okay? Did you have? You sure?
Yeah, thank you. I guess I'm also still unconvinced by Lefort, maybe a bit confused, so please clarify. if you can. So he clearly distances himself from Marx's political project, it seems, and from his analytical framework of specifically what I'm thinking about is the base versus the superstructure here, where the base conditions the superstructure, and that is like law, state, education, all of that. And so I'll see that discourse, that human rights discourse, has this emancipatory element materially and very practically that doesn't really end up being equal, right? And it still ends up coinciding with the economic base and with the economic relations that are inherent to our capitalist system. So I really wonder how, since we're still so embedded in these class antagonisms, how Lefort is able to make this move away from the base superstructure argument, and how we can see this emancipatory discourse actually translated into material and practical human rights being able to emancipate us.
Thank you. Are you sure? You're sure? You're sure? Okay. All right. So,
My
Jean,
last-
why don't you have the last,
This is
why don't you have the last thing? And then actually, you're all invited to, we're going to go across the street and have drinks so we can continue the conversation, but we'll stop
Okay,
at that.
I think we have to do the role thing between concept and conception. Marx offers the conception of rights that he describes, and I'm just talking about one text, but on the Jewish question, it's there. You can read it, right? Freedom, security, maybe he talked about communication. I don't remember at this point. But the conception that he gave was, in effect, the bourgeois version. In other words, freedom is the freedom to do what I want. I'm a sovereign individual. Equality is the equality of us to be sovereign individual monads. Security is really proper, all this stuff. Now, Lefort said, he didn't say that's wrong. Neither did I. I said it's not the whole story. There are other conceptions, and you can't reduce the concept of rights to that. One. Two, differentiation period, by Satan, civil society, and other domains. Yes, that's a condition for capitalism to emerge, because it's not, feudalism or absolutism anymore. That's true, that, the economy does its thing, or composes the system, whatever. But civil society is not reducible to the economy. It's my second point. There's a lot more going on there. Like this, for example. Like associations, like movements, like all kinds of things. It's not going to do public affairs, newspapers, but this is not the press. It's not reducible to it. Then you have to ask, well, what are the relationships between them? But that's a question. That's not an answer. Okay. Now, with base superstructure, yeah, you get before definitely drops the basic, that's for sure. And so do I, because it is a reductionist approach. And so I don't think the state is an epiphenomenon of capitalist social relations. In fact, you could say the state was very important in instituting, creating the conditions for capitalism, A, and B, if it's an epiphenomenon, then nothing's any different. The oligarchy that's about to come into power with Trump is no different than anything else. So, but it's not just that. That's being facetious because I'm not happy about what just happened. But the base, yes, he definitely abandons the base superstructure, but I would not say that he abandons the project if it's understood as a project, use the usual terms, freedom, emancipation. Maybe where the word revolution is a little complicated. We have to figure out what we mean by that. It's a big discussion, but fundamental transformation, not transformation of relational domination. Of course, he doesn't bend it. He does not. And so I think that we all should bend the basic. I think it conceals more than it reveals. But conceals. I think we all should bend in the basic superstructure model because it conceals more than it reveals, which does not mean that we have to ignore or abandon Marx's analyses of capitalism and of other things, because it's a brilliant, it's an incredibly, well, it's brilliant. He was right about a lot, but he wasn't right about everything. Come on, it's just interesting though. We have to sort of do some work. Here. Thank you.
All right. Well, that's a good place to That's a good place to stop, I think. Thank you so much, Jean Cohen, for that. And thank you all for being here. As I mentioned, we're going across the street to Arts and Craft for food and drink. You are all invited. It's on the house. And then you're also invited to come back on Tuesday, November 26th. Okay, so that's Marx 413 is on Tuesday, November 26th at 6 p.m. right here. We're turning to Marx's economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. And we're going to be reading them with a brilliant philosopher, psychoanalyst, Renata Selekel. And she's going to be focusing on kind of many of the topics that we were talking about today, anxiety and questions of in the fears of totalitarianism, but also among folks on the extreme right. What's going on in terms of alienation, forms of alienation. So we'll be exploring the questions of alienation with her through a psychoanalytic lens. She's asked us to read Lacan's The Butcher's Wife's Dream seminar. So we'll be reading that and thinking about alienation. So please come back on Tuesday, November 26th. And in the meantime, let's go meet